Hello, everyone. Hope you're doing well. My name is Zachary Strong. I am a scholar who's been studying psychology and neuroscience for the last 8 years. And on my YouTube channel, I typically cover biblical topics, but I figured today I would do a little psychology video where I talk about Dr. Jordan B. Peterson and what I think is his biggest academic contribution. So, if you know Dr. Peterson, you're aware that his 1999 work, Maps of Meaning, um, is kind of the backbone of everything that he's done. And so, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to do a bit of a deep dive into Maps of Meaning and really what he discovered in Maps of Meaning, which was a link between psychology and ethics. Now, one of the main problems in science in general is that the scientific discoveries we make don't seem to necessarily tell us what we should do, how we should behave. And as far as I can tell, Dr. Peterson's main discovery, his main contribution, is showing us that the things that we've discovered in psychology and neuroscience actually point to how human beings should behave. So, what Dr. Peterson really did was provide a link or a bridge between psychology and ethics. And so, in this video, I'm going to be diving into kind of how he did that and, kind of what he uncovered. So, in today's video, we're going to start off with the problem of science versus ethics, which I've talked about a little bit already. Then I'm going to dive into Dr. Peterson's discoveries in Maps of Meaning. And I'm also going to be bringing forth some neuroscience, which came out after he wrote Maps of Meaning. And then I'm also going to go on a bit of a tangent about the Übermensch, Nietzsche's concept of the superhuman, which has been influential for Dr. Peterson. And as it turns out, psychology and neuroscience is validating this concept generally. So, let's dive into science versus ethics. So, one of the main problems, as I've mentioned, is that scientific discoveries don't always tell us what we should be doing. Okay, and this is known as the ought from is problem. So, I think it was David Hume that first came up with this. This was a couple hundred years ago, but basically people realized that as we were making scientific discoveries, this didn't always tell us how we should behave or what our ethics ought to be. Okay, so they call it the ought from is problem. And this is generally considered to be an unsolvable problem. Okay, it's generally considered to be an unsolvable problem. But, as I'll get into, Dr. Peterson has largely solved it. Okay. So, in order to solve this problem, we have to use something called consilience. Okay, and consilience is a word that was developed in the 1800s, which means an agreement between the approaches to a topic between different academic subjects. So, if science is coming to certain conclusions, and philosophy is coming to certain conclusions, and religion is coming to certain conclusions, and everyone, all different fields are kind of agreeing on certain things, that's called consilience. Okay, no matter which way you look at an issue, if every different field is starting to agree on certain things, you could be reasonably sure that this thing that they're all agreeing on is either true or most likely true. Okay, so that's a big aspect of Dr. Peterson's work, which I'll get into. Now, interestingly, also in the 1800s, Friedrich Nietzsche talked a little bit about consilience, although he never really used the word. So he basically said that in order to develop a sense of values or ethics, we need to become physicists. Okay, and he pointed out that a lot of values and ethics have been based on ignorance of physics or were constructed to contradict physics. And so famously, Nietzsche is well known for saying, "Long live physics," and even more so, which compels us to turn to physics, our honesty. Okay, so even Nietzsche was kind of talking about consilience in other ways in his work. Okay, he was saying that in order to develop values and ethics, we need to look to physics, which is specifically the laws of the universe. Okay, and so when it comes to psychology and neuroscience, what those fields have been trying to do is figure out the laws and mechanisms that govern human mental behavior. Okay, and as I'll show you, they've come quite a long way, and we've discovered quite a bit. Okay, so with that, let's dive into Dr. Peterson's discovery. Okay, so in 1999, Dr. Peterson released Maps of Meaning, as I'm sure you know, and this work is actually a work of consilience. Okay, so what Dr. Peterson did was look at neuroscience, psychology. He also looked at narrative, mythology, and religion, and he looked at philosophy. And he started to piece together where all of these different fields were agreeing and what they were agreeing on. Okay, and so those points of agreement were the kinds of things that he was writing about in Maps of Meaning, and they're the kinds of things that he's famous for talking about. You know, like you gotta slay the dragon and get the gold and whatever, right? Like all of those things are his way of pointing to areas of consilience between science, religion, narrative, mythology, all of it. Okay? And that also might explain why Dr. Peterson is so committed to these ideas, is because he's seen through his work that everything kind of agrees on certain points. Okay? Which is a major discovery. Because what he did essentially was look at all sorts of different fields and connect dots between them to figure out where they agree. Okay? And that is, in its own way, a set of discoveries. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight for you what I see as the backbone of Dr. Peterson's entire work. Okay? So when you look through Maps of Meaning, when you read through it, and you understand the psychology and the neuroscience that he's citing, you realize that there's a certain neuropsychological discovery that underpins everything in Maps of Meaning. Okay? And that's called the orienting reflex. Okay? If you've read Maps of Meaning, you probably remember reading about the orienting reflex. But that is basically the central discovery that ties together all of Maps of Meaning. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to demonstrate for you the orienting reflex. Okay? What you're going to do is you're going to experience the orienting reflex, and then I'll talk about kind of what it is. Okay? Ooh, right? So that is the orienting reflex. Basically what I was doing, I was playing Chopsticks, which is a song that most people watching this will have known. Okay? But then I played a wrong note. Okay? And instinctively, intuitively, people who know Chopsticks were like, oh, that doesn't belong. That's not right. That doesn't map to what I know Chopsticks to be. Okay? And that's the orienting reflex. It is the reflexive, involuntary attunement to things that do not belong. Okay? So this was discovered by Soviet neuroscientists, and Dr. Peterson talks about it relatively early on in Maps of Meaning, but it actually forms the foundation for basically everything he's talking about. So in Maps of Meaning, Dr. Peterson says that research on the orienting reflex indicates that it does not occur as a direct result of incoming excitation. Rather, it is produced by signals of discrepancy, which develop when incoming signals are compared with the trace formed in the nervous system by an earlier signal. Okay, and he also says what Sokolov and the Soviets discovered is that human beings are characterized by an innate response to what they cannot predict, do not want, and cannot understand. Sokolov identified the central characteristics of how we respond to the unknown, to the strange category of all events that have not yet been categorized. Okay, and so the insight here is that we cannot avoid noticing things that are surprising. Okay? And in Maps of Meaning and throughout the whole book, Dr. Peterson spends a lot of time grappling with essentially the implications of the orienting reflex. Okay, because what Dr. Peterson realized is if something in the environment doesn't belong or doesn't make sense, it's new, it's anomalous, whatever. Okay, we can't help but notice that. Okay, human beings are attuned to noticing things that don't belong. And so in Maps of Meaning, what he does is say, okay, if we can't avoid things that don't belong, how do we respond to that? How do human beings respond to anomaly? How do we respond to novelty? Okay, and in Maps of Meaning, Dr. Peterson kind of breaks down two general approaches. Okay, the first option that we have when we encounter something that doesn't belong or doesn't make sense is courage or approach. Okay, so which means investigating the anomaly, learning about the environment, and also transforming ourselves in response to the anomaly. And the second approach is cowardice or retreat. Okay, denying or avoiding the anomaly, not learning, and transforming the environment to get rid of the anomaly. Okay, and in Dr. Peterson's work, he talks about kind of the hero and the villain. And the first option, approaching courageously, he characterizes as a heroic adaptation. And the second option he characterizes as more of a villainous adaptation. Okay? And so what you have is the orienting reflex and then two kinds of responses to the orienting reflex. Okay, what we do about it. And that forms the backbone of Dr. Peterson's work. And when you understand, that psychology that he's bringing forth, the dragon metaphors and all of the metaphors that he uses, it makes way more sense. It makes way more sense because really what he's talking about is the two types of responses to anomaly. Okay? Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a brief detour into neuroscience. Okay, and Dr. Peterson has talked with this neuroscientist on his channel, but essentially I'm going to talk about one of the most complicated things in neuroscience right now, which is the free energy principle developed by Carl Friston. Okay, so brief detour. Information is a form of energy, essentially. Okay, so in the 1940s, folks at Bell Labs were trying to discover the physics of signals and information, and they did a really good job. The book is called A Mathematical Theory of Communication. And basically, they found that information, signals, and all kinds of information follows the same laws as entropy. Okay, so they found that information and signals and communication falls under the laws of physics, and we can kind of figure out how. So building on that, in the 2000s and 2010s, Carl Friston developed the free energy principle. And he realized, by doing a whole bunch of neuroscience and a whole bunch of math, that the brain, if we look at the brain as an information processing unit, he realized that the brain tries to minimize surprise. Okay, and there's a whole bunch of complicated math, and most people don't even understand it. I still struggle with the math, but I understand it conceptually. Carl Friston basically pointed out that the brain, when confronted with anomaly or surprise, tries to minimize that surprise. And much like Dr. Peterson did in 1999, Carl Friston realized that there are only two ways for the brain to minimize surprise. The first is to update the mental model that the brain has, which is learning and growing. The second is to change the environment and get rid of the anomaly. Okay? So Carl Friston's work on the free energy principle actually validates what Dr. Peterson was developing in maps of meaning, which I think is quite interesting. Now, if we put all of this together, Dr. Peterson's work, Dr. Friston's work, if we put all of this together, what do we get? Okay? So the free energy principle says that the human brain tries to minimize surprise either by changing its own understanding or by changing the environment. Dr. Peterson emphasized the orienting reflex, which is that the human brain cannot avoid noticing things that are new or surprising. And so this brings us to the concept of heroism and tyranny. Okay, so people who are oriented towards adapting to surprise are heroic, and people who are oriented towards avoiding adaptation are or become tyrannical. Okay, because if you don't want to change yourself in response to what's going on in the environment, then you are forced to basically stamp out everything that you don't like in the environment. Okay, which can become tyrannical, especially when you're dealing with other people. You know, like let's say like you have a kid and the kid starts crying for some reason or whatever, right? You can either become curious and say, "Hey, what's wrong? What's going on?" right? Or or you could basically say like, "Stop crying, toughen up, blah blah blah," which is tyrannical, right? You don't want to necessarily treat kids like that. So between the free energy principle and the orienting reflex and so on, what we're left with is two modes of interaction with the world. One is heroic adaptation, okay, and the other is, tyrannical denial and controlling the environment and stamping out everything that you don't like. Okay? Now, in Maps of Meaning, Dr. Peterson is really concerned with things like tyrannical regimes and the Soviets and the Nazis and genocide and so on. Okay? And those kinds of phenomena, okay, they are really just extensions of these two modes of being. Okay? Because we'll use the Soviets as an example. Okay? They were like the Soviets in general were faced with opposition. Okay? They were trying to plan the whole economy. They were trying to, control everything. And so, in order to maintain that level of control, they needed to have a wide network of informants, and they needed a gulag system, like essentially an extensive prison system, and so on. And why? Because anyone who spoke against the regime is an anomaly. Okay, it's an anomaly. And so the regime is either forced with, okay, we adapt in response to the feedback that we're getting, or we stamp out the anomaly and it's off to gulag for you. Okay, so genocide and gulags and all of those things are really just so like society-wide versions of the fundamental responses. Okay, and so Dr. Peterson really hit on something interesting here, and it actually has a wide variety of application. Okay, to use another example, the Nazi regime. Okay, so they were faced with an anomaly, I suppose, and in Germany in the 1920s and 1930s, the question was like, why are things so bad? Why did we lose World War One? And, why, what, blah, 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 right? And so, for various reasons, they looked at the Jews, and Jewish people are anomalies, okay? They're different, right? And so it's like, okay, these people are different. Some of them seem to be doing better than us economically, blah, blah, blah. Why is that? And instead of adapting in response to the anomaly, they decided to try to stamp out everything that they could, right? Which is where you got the Holocaust from. But again, it's just one of those two modes of responses: adaptation versus tyrannical controlling the environment. Okay? Now, the really interesting thing is how we can tie these discoveries to ethics. Okay? And specifically virtue ethics. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to describe a virtue as a pattern of effective behavior. Okay, and some philosophers would probably disagree with me here. They would say, oh, there's different definitions. But I'm going to use kind of a neutral definition of virtues are effective behavior. Okay? And so the question is, how do we derive virtues from science? Okay, and the deeper question is, based on the functioning of the human brain, based on what we've found in psychology and neuroscience, what are personal qualities that would allow someone to be most effective in adapting to their environment? Okay? So what we're really looking at here is, based on the orienting reflex and the free energy principle and so on, what are personal qualities that someone needs to have in order to be most effective? Okay? And typically this means most effective at adapting to their environment. Okay? Because forcing the entire world to conform to what's in your head is a losing strategy. Okay? As we've seen with the USSR and Nazi Germany and so on, like, it's got a limited shelf life. Okay? So it's not effective in the long term. What is effective in the long term is adaptation. Okay? So what we can do is we can actually look at certain virtues or personal qualities that create the conditions for effective adaptation. Okay? One of those is honesty. Okay? So being willing to admit something exists in the environment or within yourself. Okay? If you can't acknowledge the information that is coming to your brain, you're not going to be able to adapt to it. Okay? So the more honest you are, the better off you're going to be, the more effective you're going to be. A second virtue would be courage. Being willing to think or act based on the information you receive. Okay? So if you're honest enough to admit something, then you need to be willing to think about it or act on it, based on the reality you're being presented with. A third one would be curiosity. Okay, actively being interested in new information. Okay, being essentially open-minded and curious about your environment. Okay, so this is also a virtue. And similarly, we can look at vices or personal qualities that are ineffective. Okay, one of them is willful ignorance. Okay, avoiding the truth. Another one would be arrogance, refusing to acknowledge information or refusing to acknowledge the importance of the information that you're getting. Basically refusing to consider things. Cowardice is also, a vice, refusing to think or refusing to act. Okay? And so what we find essentially with what Dr. Peterson has been doing is that he's been building a bridge between psychology, neuroscience, and ethics. Okay? Because what he's showing is that based on how the human brain works, based on, the fact we exist in a world and have to engage with our environment, there are certain qualities, certain personal qualities, which are more effective. Okay? And it just so happens that those personal qualities, like curiosity, honesty, and courage, okay, those things are generally praised in philosophy. Those things are praised within religion. Like everyone kind of agrees that, things like honesty and courage and curiosity, everyone kind of agrees that those are good qualities to have. Okay, and so what we're able to do essentially is move from scientific discovery to virtue ethics. Okay, based on the way the world is, how ought we to act? How ought we to be? Okay, and I think this is monumental. I think this is monumental, right? Because for a long time, philosophers had different kinds of arguments for things, and religion says, oh, you should be this way, and so on. But now with science, we're able to look at the neuroscience of the human brain and the psychology of how the brain operates, and so on. And we're able to actually see that certain ways of being and certain personal qualities are more effective for yourself and for everyone. Okay? And so we're able to actually move from scientific discovery to virtue ethics. And that hasn't really been done up until Maps of Meaning. Okay? I think Jordan Peterson was one of the first people to really bridge this gap, which, it's a monumental achievement. Okay? And I haven't actually seen anyone talk about his work quite in this way. Okay, I think in some sense, like, people haven't fully grasped the profundity of what Dr. Peterson did with Maps of Meaning. Okay, moving from is to ought, okay, is considered basically like the holy grail of science. And Dr. Peterson was the one who did it, or at least he was one of the very first people to do it. So I think that's a major discovery, and that's kind of why I made this video. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take a little bit of a detour to Friedrich Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, or the superhuman. Okay, and if you know Dr. Peterson, you know that Friedrich Nietzsche was a big influence on him. So I figured I'd talk a little bit about this in this video as well. Because it turns out that some of the things that Friedrich Nietzsche was talking about have also been validated by psychology and neuroscience. Okay? So, the Übermensch. The Übermensch is basically this idea that Friedrich Nietzsche had, that human beings are designed to grow and improve, usually through struggle. Okay, and he expresses this in his work as a downgoing and an overgoing. Okay, so in his work, Friedrich Nietzsche says, what is great in humans is that they are a bridge and not a goal. What is lovable in humans is that they are an overgoing and a downgoing. I love those that know not how to live except as downgoers, for they are the overgoers. I love the great despisers because they are the great adorers, and arrows of longing for the other shore. I love those who do not first seek a reason beyond the stars for going down and being sacrifices, but sacrifice themselves to the earth, that the earth of the superhuman may hereafter arrive. I love those who live in order to know, and seek to know in order that the superhuman may hereafter live. Thus they seek their own downgoing. Okay, so Nietzsche's being a little bit poetic here, but essentially what he's saying is we need to embrace the challenges that we're given. We need to learn from those challenges, the downgoings, and we need to overcome them and grow from them. Okay, and when we do that, we embody the Übermensch, or the superhuman. Now, this could just be considered, a lofty philosophical concept and so on. But it turns out that psychology and neuroscience are validating large aspects of this. And indirectly, it's also validating a lot of what Dr. Peterson says. Okay, so the Center for Creative Leadership has identified certain conditions for growth. Okay? They identify that you need kind of three things in order to really grow psychologically. One of those they call heat experiences, which are challenging and uncomfortable situations that prompt growth. Colliding perspectives, where people are exposed to different worldviews and backgrounds. And then elevated sense making, the process of integrating new experiences and perspectives to develop a more complex and sophisticated way of thinking. Okay, so we can kind of see what Nietzsche is talking about in terms of downgoing or heat experience, and then overgoing, which is, new perspectives and elevated sense making. Now, the really interesting thing is that developmental psychology has been kind of grappling with this problem for decades. Okay, and educational psychology has also been grappling with this problem for decades. Okay, and it turns out that from the perspective of educational psychology, learning is cyclical. Okay, every single model of learning that I have seen in my research is cyclical. Okay, so top left is Carl Friston's free energy principle, which is neuroscience. Top right is David Kolb's experiential learning cycle. Bottom left is Jack Mesereau's transformative learning cycle. And bottom right is the hero's journey. All of these things, all of these cycles, first of all, are cycles. And second of all, they involve heat experiences or a downgoing, a confrontation with anomaly. They involve reflection and new ways of being, developing new ways of being. Okay, and then a return back to reality. Okay, so everyone agrees that learning is cyclical. Everyone agrees that there's a downgoing and an overgoing. Okay, which validates what Nietzsche was saying. Now, the really interesting thing is that when you layer on developmental psychology, what you find is that there are different stages that people can move through in their lives. And these stages are essentially kinds of perspectives. Okay, and later stages are more sophisticated perspectives. Okay, and some people call this spiral dynamics. It's kind of the most popular formulation of things. But basically, as you move through these stages, as you grow and develop psychologically, you are able to change your mindset and develop a more expansive mindset. You're able to deepen your understanding of values and how you live those values. You're able to become more emotionally mature. Okay, and all of these things allow you to better navigate stress and complexity. Okay. And so on the screen, I've got kind of a breakdown of different stages. Okay, and different people break them down in different ways, but at the lowest level you have the opportunist, which is kind of a zero-sum kind of thinking. And then at the very highest level you have what some people call the alchemist, which has a visionary mindset, someone who can embrace paradox, someone who inspires transformational impact through their imagination and so on. And so these are different stages that people can develop through. Okay, and most people in the Western world are at either diplomat, expert, or achiever. Okay, so most people are stuck in what's known as formal development, whereas, the later stages are known as post-formal development. Okay, now, the reason that I'm bringing this up is, to tie it back to Friedrich Nietzsche's concept of the superhuman. Okay, because it turns out that there are stages of psychological development. Most people are at kind of the mid-tier, but there's higher levels of being that most people don't even know exist. Okay, and that's the kind of thing that Friedrich Nietzsche was pointing to with his concept of the superhuman. Okay, and I think it's very interesting that not only is Dr. Peterson validating a lot of things in philosophy and religion and so on. But when it comes to one of his biggest influences, Friedrich Nietzsche, um, psychology and neuroscience is validating Nietzsche's intuitions as well. So I think that's quite interesting. So yeah, that's basically what I wanted to discuss. Um, I suppose I can sum all of this up by saying that there's a continuum of psychological development that exists with wiser and more effective ways of thinking at higher stages of development. Difficulties create opportunities for growth, but people need to be willing to confront their own ways of seeing the world. Okay, which is what Dr. Peterson talks a lot about in Maps of Meaning. And then also layering on the virtues part of it. Someone's level of honesty, courage, and curiosity determines their ability to grow along this continuum. Okay, so that's basically what I wanted to highlight, is that the kinds of work that have been done in psychology and neuroscience are now allowing us to move from is to ought. Okay? This is the way that human nature works. This is the way the brain works. And then based on what is, here's the ways that we should be orienting ourselves and behaving in order to be most effective, in order to grow more, in order to, master ourselves and our environment. Okay, so we're able to move now from science to ethics, and I don't know. I think that's really significant, because it's something that a lot of people thought we would never be able to do, and ever since Dr. Peterson wrote Maps of Meaning, we've been moving rapidly towards those kinds of things. So yeah, that's what I had to talk about. I do plan, like, a lot of my channel has to do with biblical things, but I'm going to be releasing some more videos on psychology and neuroscience. Because a lot of this stuff is kind of interconnected, right? Psychology and neuroscience now brings us to ethics. Ethics is connected to, biblical belief. And so it's all kind of connected in ways that we don't always appreciate. And, that's what I'm going to be talking about more on my channel. So anyway, thank you very much for watching this video. Hope you learned something. Hope you found it interesting. And yeah, if you enjoyed this, like and subscribe for more.